Hi, and welcome to the final session of this great day of talks and researchED Stockholm. My name is Niklas Levy, and I'm the publishing director of higher education in the publisher Naturkultur here, based here in Stockholm. And I have the great privilege to be the publisher of a couple of Dylan Wiliam's books, which is going to be our keynote session here. Dylan Wiliam, I don't think I need to introduce to anyone here, and without much further ado, I'd like to give you Professor Dylan Wiliam live from Florida, I think. And the name of his keynote session is What Would Research-Based Education Look Like? Dylan.
Thank you, Niklas. And I'm just going to begin by sharing my screen. Just going to adjust this a little bit. And so my aim in this talk is to suggest a way that teachers and schools can make education research-based without really worrying too much about making it research-driven. So I think that the outline is I want to start off with two overriding issues about how we might change education. The first is I think we need to understand why things are the way they are. Then I want to spend a little time arguing that we need to understand that improving anything involves making trade-offs. These trade-offs can be planned and argued about, or they can be made in an unplanned way, just as results of decisions taken somewhere else down the line. I then want to spend most of the time talking about what educational research can and cannot do. So let me start with a framework for thinking about education and in particular improvement. And there's a short story that I find quite useful. It's called it's about Chesterton's fence. And so there's a quote which I've produced in full. And so it's about somebody who wants to get rid of a fence. And the man says, well, if you want to get rid of the fence, tell me why it's there. And the man says, I don't know why it's there, it's just useless. And the first man says, well, until you can tell me why it's there, I will not let you get rid of it. And this is, I think, a really important point about improvement in education. Until you understand why things are the way they are, then I think changing things is quite risky. So we often say, well, this is pointless, and therefore we say we're going to get rid of this, but it may not be as simple as you thought. So I think that idea of Chesterton's fence is quite powerful, and I think the important thing we then need to realize is that there are no perfect solutions, there are only trade-offs. So any proposal for change, people say I want to do this rather than this, they're usually clear about what their proposal is going to make better that was previously not very good. But they're usually not very good about saying what the previous system did very well. And I think we have to understand that, because when we change things, we might actually do some new things better. We might do some previously done things a lot worse. So I think that whenever anybody wants to improve education, they should address two questions. The first is, what will be better if changes are made? And as I said, people are pretty good about that generally. And then I think we ought to also ask them, what will be worse if these changes are made? And people often say nothing. And my argument is that if people say there'll be nothing worse, then they really have to think through a bit more carefully. If the proposer says nothing will be worse, then I think they need to think again, because there's almost always a trade-off. There are no perfect solutions, only trade-offs. My argument is we will make better decisions if we know what these trade-offs are and we make them consciously rather than having them emerge as unintended consequences of decisions taken further down the line. There'll always be trade-offs. The question is, which ones do we choose on? Which do we choose? Are they explicit? Yes, we're doing this because this is more important than that. Or do we end up somewhere which we haven't planned? So when we're talking about improving education, I think the first thing to realize is we can't afford to have teachers focusing on everything. So often countries, education systems produce standards for teachers. These are the things we want teachers to be able to do. So England has just introduced the early career teaching standards. In Australia, we have the EITSL standards for teaching and for leadership. And so different countries have these standards. Here's the important point. if you focus your teachers on everything in the standards, you will actually have very little impact. Evaluation frameworks, of necessity, have to be comprehensive. They include everything that teachers do, and at best, encourage teachers to get better at everything. At worst, encourage teachers to get better at the things that are easier to get better at. Let me give you a concrete example. Charlotte Danielson's framework for teaching has 4 domains of practice. 2 of them have a substantial impact on student achievement. 2 of them actually have 0 impact on teachers' achievement. So, for example, there's planning and preparation and professional responsibilities. Those 2 domains are part of the framework, but if teachers get better at those 2 things, then students do not learn more. So this is a real problem, because it's generally easier for teachers to get better at planning and preparation and at professional responsibilities than it is to get better at things like teaching and assessing. And so the trouble is, if we actually incentivize teachers on the basis of a comprehensive evaluation framework, we are actually incentivizing teachers to get better at things that have no benefit for students very often. To maximize improvement, any framework has to be used selectively. And then, of course, we can't afford to have teachers focusing on anything they like. Improvement frameworks are selective, and they focus on the aspects of practice with the biggest payoff for learners. But that alone is not enough. Even if we can show that more effective teachers do certain things, that's irrelevant unless we can get other teachers doing the same thing. So for anybody interested in educational improvement, I think the key question is, if we have so many hours of professional development time with our teachers, what use of that professional development time is going to have the biggest impact for students? The big idea here is opportunity cost. I think opportunity cost is the single most important concept in educational improvement, because every hour teachers spend on doing one thing is an hour they don't have to spend on something else. So the key metric is, given that we have, as many countries do, say 25 hours of professional development time for every teacher per year, what use of that 25 hours is going to have the biggest positive benefit for students? That's the thing we should be focusing on. And every time we move away from that, we end up at risk of making decisions that do not benefit our learners. And this is where research comes in. The first thing to realize is that evidence-based is not a category. It's not the case that there are evidence-based and not evidence-based researchers. It's a continuum. Some things are more or less evidence-based. And research, I think, can do a lot of things. It can indicate areas where improvement efforts are unlikely to improve education very much, like learning styles, for example. Some people say that learning styles don't exist. I'm not sure that's true. What we do know is that attending to students' learning styles has no benefit for their learning, as far as we can tell at the moment. So sometimes research tells us this is unlikely to be a productive direction for moving your practice. It can also sometimes, if it's well done, tell you this works when the certain conditions are met. It can give us some indication of how much improvement is likely, and it might also give us information about the costs of the innovation. And ultimately, I think these last 2 are the most important. It's the amount of improvement we're likely to get and how much will it cost. So I want to spend a little time digging deeper into that now, about how we might learn from research. So whenever we are using research to improve our practice, we actually are involving 2 settings. There's the setting where the research was done. That's what you might call learning. And then there's the setting in which the research is applied. And Robin Hogarth and his colleagues suggest there are probably a continuum of learning environments, but the 2 extremes are kind learning environments, where there's a close match between what you learn and what you apply. A good example would be chess. When you learn things about playing chess, it's likely to be relevant to other chess games. A wicked learning environment is when there's a poor match between the informational elements in the 2 different settings. And so a wicked learning environment is one where previous experience is often not a very good guide to practice. And I would argue that teaching is a wicked learning environment, or certainly well on the way towards that extreme. So, for example, Steinberg and Garrett showed that when teachers are evaluated, teaching students, the score they get for their teacher evaluation depends on how smart their kids are. Many evaluation schemes look at how well the pupils do or the students do in a lesson. That's measuring performance, not learning, and because there's a somewhat of an inverse relationship, it's not surprising that often experienced educators systematically miss good teaching. Things that work in the short term can be less effective in the long term. The Carroll and West study showed that teachers who were less experienced actually got higher test scores on the first course their students did, but their students did less well on the future course. And therefore, teachers that looked effective in the short term were actually less effective for their students in the longer term. When things work, or when things don't work, we learn the wrong lesson. My colleague Joe Bowler and I spent a lot of time researching ability grouping in schools. And we found that students placed in lower ability groups made less progress than students in higher ability groups. And this is a big project. We tracked 1,000 students over 5 years. But now I don't know what those results mean because we didn't take into account teacher quality. It could be that the reason that the students taught in the top groups made more progress was not because it was the grouping that made the difference. It was just by chance those schools happened to assign the best teachers to the top groups. So without good theorization, you don't actually know what that means. And then another thing that's really important, things that may work in one setting may not work in a similar setting. And here is a very nice case study from medicine. So this is a total of 203 surgeons who performed coronary artery bypass grafts on almost 40,000 students, 40,000 patients, between 1994 and 1995 in Pennsylvania hospitals. So they looked at the survival rate, and the mortality rate was 3.1%. They then looked at, did the survival rates depend on how much expertise the surgeons had? In particular, how many times a month did they do this procedure? So for each extra procedure a surgeon performed in a 3-month period, the mortality rate drops by 0.015%. So if a surgeon did one procedure every day, every weekday, the mortality rate was 2.5%. If they only did one every month, the mortality rate was about 30% higher, 3.3%. So this is why people think that the more often you practice a surgical procedure, the better you get. And that might be the lesson. Make sure that the person that you're having doing this procedure to you is somebody who's done it a lot. Actually, not quite right. It turns out that for each extra procedure a surgeon performs at the same hospital, the mortality does drop. But if they do them at different hospitals, the mortality rate does not change. So the important point is, this is not a surgeon expertise effect, it's a teamwork effect. And this is why we have to be careful in drawing conclusions from research. Because if we haven't got the right kinds of theorization, the conclusions we draw, the more times a surgeon does this, the better they are, is actually incorrect. It's the more times a surgeon does something with the same team that matters. And so results are often difficult to interpret because of these theoretical, this issue of theorization. So what I'm suggesting is that if people want to use research to improve education, I think there are 5 questions we should ask. The first is, does it solve a problem we have? The second is, if we do this, how much more progress will our students make? What will be the cost in money and in terms of teacher time? Can we implement it here? And do we know what to do? I'm going to say a bit about each of these in turn. So does it solve a problem we have? If you look at the literature on merit pay for teachers, the idea of paying teachers more money for being more effective, then one of the case studies you'll see cited is by Esther Duflo, a recent Nobel Prize winner, on supplementary schools, on schools, in alternative schools in India. So Seva Mandir ran a number of non-formal education centers, and they decided to do an experiment by changing how teachers were paid. So in roughly half of these centres, teachers were paid 1,000 rupees per month. In half of the centres, teachers were paid according to whether they turned up for the job. And they had to prove this by actually sending in 2 time-stamped photos of them with their students in the school. So for those 2 teachers, they were paid a base rate of 500 rupees per month, and then an additional 50 rupees for every day they attended over the 10-day threshold. And so it did increase attendance. The fixed pay group attended 58% of days, pretty poor, much higher in the incentive group, and this had a knock-on in student learning. So a 32% increase in students' learning time and a 25% increase in annual progress. And so people say this is evidence that paying teachers more, if they do their job well, improves student achievement. Well, yes, if teachers are not coming to school. But what the research on merit pay shows, on most incentives, in fact, is that they're very effective in improving performance on low creativity, low complexity tasks, but less effective for high complexity, high creativity tasks. So if your teachers are already turning up to school, then paying them to turn up to school isn't going to help. That's why the first question we always have to ask is, does this research solve a problem we have? If we do this, question 2, how much faster will our students learn? And this is why people often reach for meta-analyses. The idea is we aggregate different results from different experiments to come up with a single number that tells us how much improvement we get on average. So the idea is, we can't use the results of the experiment because different experiments use different measures. And therefore we put them all on the same ruler. So typically, for example, if I said that my new way of teaching mathematics improves student scores by 1 point, it depends what measure you're using. If it's the SAT, where the scores range from 200 to 800 in the US, then that's a small effect. If it's the American College Testing, as it used to be called, the ACT test, where the scores range from 1 to 36, then it's a much smaller but still worthwhile effect. If it's advanced placement tests, where the scores range from 1 to 5, then it's an implausibly large effect. So 1 point doesn't mean anything until you know how spread out the scores are. And that's why we usually define standardized effect size as the difference between the experimental group and the control group divided by some measure of spread. And the thing we usually try to get is the population standard deviation, which we often don't have. Therefore, we use some estimate of the population standard deviation, such as the means of the experimental and control group. The problem is, meta-analysis doesn't work very well in education. It works very well in medicine, but it works really badly in education for a range of reasons that I've listed there, and I'll go through them all in detail. So first of all, inappropriate comparisons. Some studies report net effects more than the control group. Some studies report gross effects, how much compared with nothing. And so, for example, John Hattie says that an effect size of 0.4 is the hinge, if you like, the basic minimum, because he reckons, and he's probably right as an average, that 1 year's learning is 0.4 standard deviations. Paul Black and I reported an effect size of 0.32 for one of our first studies on formative assessment. If you think of John Hattie's guideline, you say, well, that's a very small effect. No, it's not a small effect, because that 0.32 is how much faster than other teachers' students in those schools progressed. So the 0.32 is on top of business as usual, so it's actually an 80% increase in the rate of student progress. Some studies report their effect sizes at student level. Some report them at teacher level. So a study by Claude Goldenberg and his colleagues on teacher learning communities, for example, reported an effect size of 0.8. This was at the teacher level. Teachers working in these communities were actually as effective as teachers in the control group, who are 0.8 standard deviations higher up the effectiveness range. But because the correlation of teacher quality and student progress is about 0.2, the student level effect size is only about 0.16. And adding 0.8 to numbers like the 0.16 makes no sense at all. Then there's also the issue of, what do we compare? Is it business as usual versus the experiment, or is it comparing it with the best available alternative treatment? The second issue is the file draw problem. And this is a real problem because most educational experiments are underpowered. In other words, they're so small that if they do produce a significant result, it's a fluke. So if an experiment actually is trying to find an effect which has a true effect size of 0.4 standard deviations, then if your experiment has a power of 80%, if you only report the significant studies, you will report an effect size of 0.47 because only the lucky studies get published, the ones where you manage to get over the 80% threshold. And if the studies are more like 0.4, as they are in psychology and education, or even 0.2, as they are in neuroscience, for example, the studies that get published massively overrepresent the true effect size because the studies that get published are the ones that were lucky, the ones where everything happened to go right, and they're not good guides to what would happen to a typical implementation. A really stark demonstration of this was done by Kvaven and her colleagues. They looked at meta-analyses and then they compared the effect sizes reported by the meta-analyses and compared them with the effect sizes that you'd get if you only included pre-registered, in other words, people said what they're going to do before they started the experiment, and done on more than one site. The pre-registration is particularly important because researchers often switch the outcomes. So for example, you might have an experiment trying to look at achievement in mathematics, and you find no significant effect on mathematics achievement, but then the researchers notice that the students getting the experimental treatment were more positive about mathematics. So then they say, oh well, so we actually report the positive attitude change. But then you can't use the 0.05 confidence level, significance level, because you've actually had two tests. You've given yourselves two bites of the cherry. And so you have a good experiment will be pre-registered. Here's the tests we're going to run. And we're not going to switch the outcomes if the answer doesn't come out the way we like it. So what's interesting is this chart shows what they found. So the red squares are showing the published effect sizes with error bars, and the green boxes show the estimates achieved by restricting the analysis to pre-registered multi-site studies. And what you could see is the green boxes, the green squares, are much further to the left than the red boxes, the red squares. And what they found was that the average effect size in the well-designed meta-analyses, pre-registered multi-site studies, were only 1/3 as great. So publication bias is a huge issue. Interventions also differ in their quality. If we actually say we're going to reduce class size, what is the effect of reducing class size? Well, obviously reducing class size by 20% is going to have a smaller effect than reducing class size by 50% if the experiment is successful. And so, what do we mean by the intervention? People try to evaluate response to intervention. This idea that students who aren't thriving in the mainstream classroom should be able to go with a smaller classroom, with a smaller group of teachers, smaller group of students, with another teacher, and then there's what they call tier 3, which is much more intensive still. But here's the important point, is that first group 2 or 4 or 8 students? Are they taken out for 8 weeks or 2 weeks? So the intensity of the intervention is crucial in making sense of any effects we find. And there's also the collateral effects that I mentioned earlier. The assignment of teachers in the setting project that Joe Bowler and I did. We didn't understand the importance of teacher quality at the time, so we didn't even try to measure it. The important point is subsequent work has shown that our interpretation of the data is not the only one. It could be a completely different effect. Another particularly significant issue in educational research is the variation in how variable the students are. So you divide by this population standard deviation in the effect size calculation. And the important thing to remember is as students get older, they get more variable. So the best model that I have for these data is that some students learn faster than others, and therefore the longer they've been around, the bigger the gap. And this comes from the work of Howard Bloom and his colleagues, and it shows that 1 year's learning for a 6-year-old is about 1.5 standard deviations. One learning for a 15-year-old is about 0.2 standard deviations, as measured by standardized tests. So if your experiment increases the rate of learning by 50%, you do it with 6-year-olds, you'll get an effect size of 0.76. If you get the same rate of improvement for 15-year-olds, the reported effect size will be 0.1. So it's the same improvement in the rate of learning, but you get very different reported effect sizes. And I would say adding these kinds of numbers together makes no sense at all. Studies with younger children produce larger estimates. Studies with gifted students or students with special needs, restricted populations, will also inflate the estimates of effect sizes. The next issue, the penultimate issue, is the selection of studies. And as Leif Nelson has argued, the average effect does not exist, because to actually come up with a true average in your meta-analysis, you would have to have the conducted studies that were significant and reported, the studies that were non-significant and reported, the ones that were significant and not reported for some reason, the ones that were not significant and not reported. One estimate in health education is that it's 12 times easier to get an experiment result published if it's significant than if it's not significant. So this is the statistical power thing I mentioned earlier. We should also think about, what about all the experiments that were not conducted, but that would have been significant if they had been conducted, and the non-conducted studies that would have been non-significant if they had been conducted. And so this is why meta-analysis is really problematic. It's because it's assumed that the published studies are representative of all the other studies that might have been done. And given this long list of things that you ought to be including, I don't think that's a safe assumption. I think there is no reason to assume that the things that are published are representative of the things that are not published. And finally, and I think the one that plagues education most severely, is this idea of sensitivity to instruction. Does the outcome measure the things that we want to improve? Now, what we find, in fact, is that in some experiments, the measures they use are very sensitive to the things that teachers change. And in other experiments, the measures used are very insensitive to the things that teachers change. One example of this comes from the work of Maria Ruiz Primo, Rich Shilson, Hamilton, and Klein. They looked at the effects of feedback in different kinds of science education settings, and they looked at the measures that we used. So some experiments used really immediate assessments of student performance. Some actually asked students to apply what they've just learned in a different context. Some they called proximal, where the outcome measure was applying it in a slightly different context. A distal measure would be applying it in a much more remote context, and a remote context would be a standardized national achievement test. So here's an example of the effect sizes they found. Where the measure that used in the experiment was a proximate measure, they got an effect size of about 0.2, 0.25. Where the measure used in the experiment was closer to what it was that teachers were trying to teach, the effect size was about 6 times greater. So the effect sizes that you get depend to a really quite huge extent on the measures that you're using and whether they are measuring the things that teachers are trying to change. So that's why I would argue that effect sizes in education are justifiable only when they are necessary. You see, if all the different experiments we're combining use the same outcome measure, then we don't need an effect size. We can just report the scores on the outcome measure. If you need to convert those scores into an effect size because they're not measuring on the same scale, they're not the same kind of assessment, then you have no justification for using an effect size. Effect sizes are justifiable only when they're unnecessary. And I would say that we should stop using effect sizes in education because they're meaningless. Nobody knows what they mean. I think there's only one measure we should be looking at: a rate increase. Because any improvement in educational processes results in students learning more in a given time period or taking less time to learn a given amount. So it's a rate increase in the rate of learning. So I think that the only useful metric is an indication of that rate increase, such as extra months of learning per year. Now, there's been quite a strong scholarly debate about this recently, and people have argued that these are difficult to achieve. Yes, they are, but the point is they're the only ones that matter. Researchers say that they prefer percentile growth measures or effect sizes, but they're focusing on their job as researchers. For teachers to make decisions about whether it's worth investing teachers' time, I would say that the only metric that's useful is, will our students learn more in the same amount of time if we do this thing? And if researchers can't provide that information, they need to go back to the drawing board. That, I would say, is the only important metric. So when can you trust meta-analyses? Well, I would say when the exact nature of the intervention is clear. So don't say cooperative learning, because that actually could be different in different settings. It needs to be a clear intervention. When publication bias is investigated and ideally corrected, so there are well-established ways of correcting for at least some kinds of publication bias. And then also when the researchers look carefully to see, were there differences in the size of effects for pre-registered versus unregistered studies? Did it depend on the age of the students? Were some measures more sensitive? And if a meta-analysis does all those things, I think it could be trusted. When can meta-analyses, these syntheses of research that people have proposed, I would say only when you can trust all or most of the constituent meta-analyses. And I think the particularly important things are things like inappropriate comparisons and the idea that the studies that get done are not a random sample of all the studies that could get done. The next question, maybe the most important question, I think, as for school leaders, is can we implement this here? So let me give you an example. The Tennessee class size reduction study, the Tennessee STAR study as it's sometimes called, is often reckoned to be one of the best educational experiments of the last century. So they did something really quite remarkable. They randomly allocated teachers to students, and they randomly allocated students to classes of either standard size, 22 to 26, standard size with a teacher aide, or smaller classes. And there's no doubt, and people have argued about this, but there's no doubt that the students in the smaller classes did better years later. So Hank Levin and his colleagues estimated that there was an 11 percentage point increase in high school graduation rate 10 years after the experiment was done. So this led to efforts in California and Florida to reduce class size. But there were actually some complications. The first was that it turns out that some of the parents found out about this experiment, and they found out that some students were being in smaller classes as part of this experiment. And it looks like some of the pushy parents found out their children were in one of the bigger classes, pressured to have them move to one of the smaller classes. So some of the effect might have been caused by high-achieving middle-class students being moved into the smaller classes. But I think that the two more significant issues are the fact that the schools were not representative of all the schools in Tennessee. You see, if I go back to the previous slide, you can see that to participate in this experiment, because they used a within-school design, you had to have at least 57 students in kindergarten for the school to be eligible, because you wanted one class of at least 22 with an aide, one class of 22 without an aide, one class of 13. So you need 57 students. Which were these schools? Urban schools. Very few rural schools were large enough to participate. So the point is that the participating schools in the experiment were not representative of all the schools in Tennessee, all the primary schools in Tennessee. We get that all the time. We do a randomized controlled trial in education, and we recruit schools, some of the control, some of the treatment group. But here's the important point. What about all the schools that did not choose to volunteer? Can we assume that they are representative of the schools that did volunteer? Usually, no. The other complication in this particular study was the availability of additional teachers. So they needed about an extra 50 teachers to run this experiment, because with smaller classes, you need more teachers. And finding 50 teachers across a state is probably a reasonable requirement. But of course, when this was implemented in Florida, statewide, then a lot of districts found that all their good teachers left to go to more affluent, richer districts, And so they were actually employing teachers who I don't think should be teaching because they needed to fill the classrooms. So the class size effect is real. In general, pupils do learn more when they're taught in a smaller group, but there's also a teacher quality effect. And if the teachers you're adding are as good as the ones you've already got, then you'll get the class size effect. But if the teachers that you're adding are less good than the teachers you've already got, then the class size effect will be fighting the teacher quality effect. And in general, the teacher quality effect is bigger than the class size effect. So class size reduction can actually reduce in reducing student achievement. So for that reason, I would argue, following Nancy Cartwright, that there's no such thing as a gold standard in research. Randomized controlled trials are not the gold standard. Randomized controlled trials can show us that the difference between the control group and the experimental group are probably real. What they cannot show is whether the non-participating settings are representative. And so this is this distinction that we need to make between what works and what worked. All we know from a randomized controlled trial is what worked in this particular setting. Finally, do we know what to do? And this is a subject of a recent paper by Anne Scheel, and she's pointing out that actually, even when we get a result, we don't know what it means because most claims in the literature, as she says, are so critically underspecified that attempts to empirically evaluate them are doomed to failure. So she would argue that this replication project, would this experiment produce the same result if done in a different context? She says that question is meaningless because you don't even know what it means to do the experiment a second time because the nature of the intervention is so badly specified that you have no idea whether you're doing the same experiment a second time. The idea is that, borrowing a phrase from Wolfgang Pauli, these results are not even wrong, because to be wrong, they would actually have to be something researchable there to test it against. So I would say there are three things that we should look for in designing, in adopting research to help our guidance about what to do with our time as teachers and leaders. The first is adequate theorization. Does it take account of all the things that you know from your own experience make a difference? So for example, does it control for teacher quality, as the Tennessee class size study failed to do, and as my work with Joe Bowler failed to do? Are they standardized interventions? Do we know what they did? So that's why I think we should be looking for products rather than just ideas. Being told that the effect size for cooperative learning is 0.4 tells us nothing until you know exactly what it was those teachers were told about cooperative learning, and more importantly, what they actually did in their classrooms. And the last thing is, there's a big issue in education around fidelity of implementation. And often researchers say, well, this intervention was not implemented with fidelity. And I think fidelity of implementation is often just a way of blaming teachers. It's these researchers blaming teachers for not doing what the researchers wanted the teachers to do. But if the intervention is so complicated that the teachers couldn't do it, then I don't think that's the teacher's fault. I think that's the researcher's fault. So what we need are intention to treat analyses. In other words, not comparing the places where this was implemented properly and the places where it was not implemented properly. That's the researcher's question. The policymaker's question is, if we adopt this policy, will it work better? And that's why we should be comparing all the people in the control group with all the people in the experimental group, irrespective of how well they implemented it. That's what an intention to treat analysis does. So, my conclusion here, those 5 questions, I think, are the ways to guide our actions. But what it suggests is that if education is to be research-based, it has to involve practitioners, teachers, and leaders making judgments about whether that experimental result has any validity in their own context. In other words, educators need to be critical consumers of education research. The idea is that research will never tell teachers what to do. It can guide their actions, but you always have to be aware of the contextual effects, which in education are really substantial. So the summary is that improvement involves trade-offs. There are no perfect solutions, only different trade-offs. Just be clear about the trade-offs you're making using the frameworks that I've suggested, and you'll probably make smarter decisions. And I'll stop there.